Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. I'm excited today because I just got a proper mic stand and pop filter in the mail. You probably won't notice a difference in audio quality, but it makes a huge difference for me to not have a light stand that I had jerry-rigged into a mic stand in my way. Anyways, I've got another Genesis Apologetics video, this time on the transitional fossils of Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik. Let's see what they have to say about that.
In both of these textbooks, they showed pictures of the Archaeopteryx fossil, supposedly half dinosaur and half bird.
Is this really what you think transitional forms are? Exactly half and half of two different kinds of animals? And that's ignoring the fact that most scientists would agree that birds actually are dinosaurs, so there is no half and half. Archaeopteryx is a transitional form between avian and non-avian dinosaurs. Now, for brevity's sake, though, the rest of the video I'll simply refer to non-avian dinosaurs as dinosaurs and avian ones as birds.
Yeah, it was discovered in 1861. Alan Fiducia, a paleontologist who led studies in the origins of birds, said this back in 1993. Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird. No amount of paleobabble is going to change that.
Alan Fiducia is actually a paleoornithologist, someone who specializes in the origin of birds. He's one of a few scientists who oppose the idea that birds are theropods and as such would be living dinosaurs, and he holds the view that they share a common ancestor with theropods instead, but are not actually theropods themselves. So if Fiducia is correct and Archaeopteryx was a flight-capable perching bird, what does this mean? Simply that it's not a transition between birds and dinosaurs, but it's a transition from primitive to modern birds. It is also important to note here that Dr. Fiducia holds an opinion that is contrary to the scientific consensus. This in and of itself does not mean he is necessarily wrong, but it does mean that the evidence at this time points more towards him being wrong than right. This is an area that's still open for debate and has not been settled by any means, but no matter which side ends up being correct, the fact remains that it is a transitional species. The fact that it's still up for debate whether it is a dinosaur or a bird actually demonstrates the fact that it's transitional pretty well. I mean, if it wasn't transitional, it would be pretty clear exactly which category it belongs in, right?
Since making that statement, there has been a constant battle in the evolutionary camp about whether Archaeopteryx should be even considered an ancestor to birds.
Even if it is not an ancestor to birds, it does show an evolutionary path. It is an animal that is clearly related to birds, but has some very distinct non-bird features, like sharp teeth, for example. So even if it is a failed evolutionary line, we can still learn quite a bit from it if we can only just refrain from dismissing it out of hand simply because it's not transitional enough? It is transitional, but it failed? It's clearly just a bird? It's clearly just a reptile? I'm not sure on what grounds you guys are trying to dismiss it, actually, and the fact that you can't make up your minds about why to dismiss it adds to the pile of evidence suggesting that it is, in fact, transitional.
And many are making the case that it should be thrown out of the evolutionary lineup.
Source, please? What evolutionary lineup are you even talking about? Bird ancestry? Even if it has no living descendants today, that doesn't diminish its scientific value. The only people I've heard suggesting that we just discard it altogether are creationists.
Going from being a bird to a dinosaur and then back to a bird.
Yeah, because it has characteristics of both, and it's hard to categorize into either one. And each new piece of evidence makes it a little clearer, but it's still hard to classify, once again strengthening the case that it is transitional. Looking at creationist websites, they seem to classify it as a bird because it obviously had feathers and does appear to be very bird-like. But upon closer examination, it's actually much more reptile than bird. In favor of bird, we have feathers, which we now know are not unique to birds, the opposable big toe, the wishbone, which can not only be found in birds but also certain theropods, and the pubis elongate and are directed backwards, which is also a feature of some theropods. In favor of reptile, we have the fact that it doesn't have a bill, the trunk region vertebrae are not fused as they are in birds, the pubic shafts have a plate-like and slightly angled transverse cross-section, the neck attaches to the skull from the rear, as in dinosaurs, not from below like in modern birds, it has a long bony tail with many free vertebrae all the way up to the tip, it has teeth, and also several other features that I'm not listing. So basically, if you examine Archaeopteryx closely, you will find that it's much more reptile than bird, yet creationists almost always have it listed as a bird. It's almost as if creationists don't quite know what they're talking about.
Archaeopteryx was even further disqualified as an evolutionary ancestor for birds when scientists found what appears to be a crow-sized bird and extinct four-winged birds in rock layers designated to be below those containing Archaeopteryx.
I am going to address this without even looking into it and assuming that you are correct in what you just said, which is a tiny bit of a stretch, I think. All that really means is that we found more information and updated our current working hypotheses to include it and be a more accurate description of the world. I don't see a problem with that.
Talk about throwing a wild pitch.
Wild pitches happen often in the game of evolution.
That's probably the most accurate thing you've said in this video so far. The phylogenetic tree of life has been reorganized several times to account for new data, and DNA sequencing was one of the biggest wild pitches ever to be thrown at it, and as a result, it is now more accurate than ever before, because unlike some people who are trying to push an agenda, good scientists are willing to change their mind based on new information, because they want to hold an accurate view of how the world works, rather than cling to the worldview that was recorded thousands of years ago and hasn't changed since. Well, it has, but that's a different story.
Like the fossil called Tiktaalik, it quickly became the missing link between fish and four-legged creatures that first walked on land.
Oh yeah, I heard of that. It was kind of the star of transitional fossils.
It certainly is one of the most well-known. I wonder what problems they have with it.
But then, in 2010, scientists announced in the journal Nature that they had found footprints of a four-legged land creature in Poland that are supposedly 10 million years older than Tiktaalik. So there goes Tiktaalik as a clear transitional fossil.
How does there being another land animal before Tiktaalik mean that Tiktaalik isn't transitional? The transition from water to land didn't necessarily only happen once. In fact, I've brought up mudskippers before in several videos as a clear example of a transitional species living today. They don't stop being transitional just because Tiktaalik did it before them. That'd be like saying that nobody except for Eric the Red and his son Leifur Eriksson ever crossed the Atlantic by boat because they did it first. Sorry, Columbus, you don't count anymore.
And yet, here it is, still in our textbook.
As it should be, because it's a very clear example of the transition from water to land. It also makes for more interesting reading than the one set of footprints that they found. Maybe if we find the fossil of whatever made those footprints, it will become more prominent than Tiktaalik, but even then, Tiktaalik will still be an important part of the history of our understanding of evolution. This is almost as bad as when Bible Flockbox brought up Tiktaalik and just dismissed it, as I think it's just a matter of time before it gets debunked.
I'm guessing it's only a matter of time before this gets debunked.
Like I said, there should be millions of transitional fossils. So if evolutionary theory can only suggest a few, and those few have major problems, it discredits the theory.
Nope, you are completely wrong there. I've mentioned this before, but technically every single animal to ever live is actually a transitional form. Our human minds want to put things in nice, neat little categories that don't necessarily exist in nature, so we look for transitions between categories, but really everything is transitional. But that aside, we have plenty of clearly transitional forms that fit between two or sometimes more of our categories without clearly belonging to either one. Archaeopteryx and Tiktaalik are two very striking examples, but there are many more out there, and considering the very specific conditions required to turn animals' bodies into fossils, it's amazing that we have as many as we do. Now that's all for today. Feel free to follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. See you next time.